Hi everyone, welcome back to Annual Conference Live with 0 to 3. I'm Will Hallex, here with our fireside chat on separation and trauma, families in crisis. I'm joined by Dr. Rebecca Shahmoon-Shanok. She's the CEO and academic director of the nonprofit Collaborations for Growth, and she's an advisor to 0 to 3. And also with Dr. Joy D. Osofsky. She's the professor of pediatrics and psychiatry, Louisiana State University Health Science Center, as well as the co-director of National Child Traumatic Stress Network Terrorism and Disaster Coalition for Child and Family Resilience. Thank you both for being here.
It's a pleasure.
So I wanted to talk to you about the session that you're going to be giving here at conference. It explores a range of disruptive events that can take an enormous toll on children and young families. And so could you tell us a little bit about what you'll be presenting on?
We're very concerned about certainly what's happening to young children in our family and the kinds of negative incidents that they're exposed to, be it abuse and neglect, domestic violence, disasters, and more recently the immigration crisis. And we felt it was very important to raise awareness and also provide information for participants at the conference about how trauma impacts on young children, and also what some of the types of things that can be done to help support children who experience trauma. We also wanted to emphasize that caregivers of traumatized children, be they clinicians, early care and education, all the other participants of this conference can also be traumatized in some ways. So our session will also include information about how to support the caregivers as we talk about the effects of trauma on young children.
Yeah, absolutely. And to speak a little bit more about family separation on the U.S. border, so what are the effects on children and families there from these policies?
Well, certainly the children, and we'll focus on the young children, but it's all the children and families in general, are attempting to come into the United States likely because they've experienced trauma in their home environment, whether it's political trauma or problems in the family or other types of things. So they probably have already experienced trauma. And then they come to the border and they're separated from a parent or caregiver who they trust and who is the main person to provide support for traumatized children and families, so that it creates additional trauma for the young children. Can be very, very frightening. They're also then traumatized again by being put in a strange situation with caregivers who they're not familiar with around a lot of other children. And so you have a complex, repeated traumatic experience on these children, which affects them in many different ways. We certainly see it in behaviors and emotion, but there's a lot of information about, particularly for very young children, the negative effects on brain development that will be long-lasting.
Absolutely. And what's, in terms of their brain development, what are some of those effects?
Well, there's a whole variety of effects, but what we end up seeing in the children are children who are possibly shut down. They may be aggressive. They may lose some of their developmental milestones and regress. And for many of the children, it's hard to make up those lost weeks, days, weeks, and months, because it's not just that they're lost, it's that they're disrupted. And we do know from brain development that it's very hard to help them to resume, and particularly because their parents are also have been through enormous trauma. It is terrifying to lose their children, so both sides are terrified. And the reunion is not necessarily easy or happy, because each has had to make certain kinds of psychological adjustments in order to just manage to live and be marginally sane during such a true catastrophe.
You know, it's very important for people to understand that children are not too young to be impacted by traumatic experiences, and being separated from the major person in their life who keeps them safe and feels them supported is incredibly traumatizing for them.
There's good research, brain research, that shows that even with moderate domestic arguing and some violence, but moderate, that children as young as 6 to 12 months register that, and it has an impact on, they can see it in the brain development. So to think that babies don't remember, even babies remember.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think it speaks to maybe the scale when considering the level of trauma that some of these disruptive events can have, when really just things that might seem moderate in comparison already have that kind of impact.
Yeah, and I also, I mean, we have good evidence and good research indicating that even brief separations will impact on children in various ways. However, if they then come back into the safe environment with familiar caregivers, the recovery is quite rapid. But I think, as Rebecca's been emphasizing here, we're also traumatizing the caregivers by separating them from their children. And again, they probably have had previous trauma, which has contributed to them coming into the United States in the first place. But 0 to 3 feels very strongly that the separation should not take place. They should be reunited as quickly as possible. And also the settings that they place young children in, if they're going to do something like, first of all, they should be placed with their parents if they're going to be placed in settings, but also it should be an environment that is supportive of young children as opposed to being frightening, which many of the environments are. The other thing that 0 to 3, and I know is partnering with other organizations also related to that, is recognizing that we need to provide more information for the caregivers of these children so they'll understand what the children have gone through and ways to be sensitive to them so that they do not continue to traumatize them, but can help be more supportive in many ways, because these children are being confronted by a lot of different people and they're strangers. And I mean, the other thing we have to recognize for young children in the first year or two of life, but the second half of the first year of life, is the time that they are learning to trust people. The period of focused attachment is what we call it. And that certainly isn't a time when you want to disrupt a child in terms of their relationship, if there's anything you can do to avoid that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's actually leads really nicely into my next question, which is a lot of the people in our digital audience are professional caregivers or service providers. And what should they have in mind when they're working with to support children and families who have gone through these kinds of experiences?
Well, they first need to know that the children have been through something very, very difficult. They need to use their abilities to observe the children, to try to find the way in for the child to begin to tell their own story through play. We do, in our field, 0 to 3, a lot of child-parent work, and it's likely that doing work with the parent and child together will help each of them begin to know the story of the other. And I want to emphasize the word story, because when you've had disruptive events, and particularly for children whose language hasn't really come in or was beginning to come in at the time that they were forcibly separated, finding coherence in the things that happened to them, trying to understand what happened to them so that the child can begin to make a story that will be revised and expanded over the course of their lifetime, because this is a lifelong event that has started. So we're wanting them to find ways to make meaning, such as there is, of what happened to them, and understand in some sense that this was not something that the parent had control of. But that takes time, and sometimes upon reunification there's some chaos, and so one of the things that we would want to make a plea for is that any child or family who has had such circumstances get the services that they need, that's an obligation for what has that should become an obligation for what has happened to these families, which they did not choose.
Absolutely. And if you're watching on our digital streams, you can learn more about these resources and explore resources on the 0 to 3 website at 0to3.org/AC Live. We hope you'll join us as well for our next fireside chat, which is going to be at the top of this coming hour at noon Mountain Time. It's going to be on the membership experience. But in the meantime, thank you both very much for joining us.
Thank you, and we appreciate your asking the questions and bringing this really very important topic to the attention of the viewers.
Absolutely. Thanks very much. We'll see you soon.